The Crossett Research Center and Experimental Forest. The Crossett Research Center and Experimental Forest. Small town living. Up until July 9, 1936, Reynolds and his wife, Geneva, lived in Crossett, first at the Rose Inn and then in a house on the southwest corner of the intersection of what is now Cedar Street and 3rd Avenue. The house was set aside for rental to Southern Station personnel. The Rose Inn was a large 3-story wooden structure with open walk-up stairways. Fig. 20. It was company-owned and provided the only public overnight housing in town. It had a large lobby with a big fireplace and a long row of rocking chairs. Another long row of such chairs adorned the long, covered front porch. Rooms on the 3rd floor were reserved for unmarried school teachers, who were required to live there. Not too much space was required since there was only one white and one black school in town. Crossett was very much off the main roads. In those days, the rooms on the 2nd floor usually could take care of visiting lumber company officials, plus 2 or 3 of the single men who worked for the company and did not have other housing. It also accommodated an occasional salesman and other visitors. The large Rose Inn dining room, always with sparkling white tablecloths on the tables and waiters with white jackets, was famous for its good food. For many years, men had to wear ties and coats before they were admitted to the room, to be reasonably sure that those who came without proper attire could have something to eat. Mr. Boardman, the hotel manager, kept a supply of extra coats and ties on a clothes tree just outside the room. Reynolds and Geneva were allowed to live and eat at the hotel on a monthly rate that was similar to the one paid by the other regulars, $30 each per month. This included steak every night, if one wanted it, and always plenty of hot biscuits and many choices of potatoes and vegetables. Crossett was strictly a lumber company town with all of the houses built, maintained, and owned by the company. Fig. 21. The houses were all built up off the ground on brick or concrete piers with plenty of crawl space underneath for the installation of piping and for reducing the problem of termites. Fig. 22. No insulation of any kind was used, so the houses were very drafty and cold in winter. All buildings were painted the same color and many looked alike, so one learned to know his house by some distinguishing feature in the yard. No yard was complete without a servant's quarters in back, and most homes enjoyed outside toilets because of the low wages paid by sawmills in general, including Crossett. Most families kept cows and chickens to help make ends meet. There was no such thing as a stock law in those days, so after milking time in the morning, the cows were turned out of each backyard to hunt for grass and other vegetation to eat during the day. Several people owned horses and pigs, and there were even a few mules. These, along with the cows, roamed at will up and down the streets, including the area that might be considered downtown. Most streets in town were unpaved, although some had a weak covering of gravel and blacktop. In wet weather, one had to try to dodge not only mud puddles but also cow piles and other off-casts. In dry weather, it was just the latter. Because of the roaming livestock, all yards were enclosed by a wooden picket fence. Wooden picket gates had a large barn door, butterfly hinge mounted horizontally at the top to keep it closed. To open the gate, one would flip one half of the hinge back on the other half. The grass in the yards always seemed to be greener than that outside the fence, to the livestock at least, and many people had some tasty garden vegetables. Thus, as one could expect, if a given gate was not locked by the hinge, or if someone left it open, the householder would more than likely have a yard full of livestock in no time. Occasionally even the hinge lock on the gates was not enough to protect the yards from grazing animals. There was one old cow, with only one short crooked horn, that was smarter than 99% of all animals in the country. She learned that if she would turn her head sideways, she could push her short, little crooked horn under the hinge and flip it over. Then she could pull the gate toward her and thus open it, and walk in. After watching her pull her trick a few times, especially after losing some of their garden to her, Reynolds and many of their neighbors installed more foolproof locks on the gates. One night Reynolds and Geneva were awakened in the middle of the night by a constant tinkling of a bell. After trying to go back to sleep without success, they realized that somehow they would have to get rid of the noisemaker. Geneva had purchased a sack of potatoes, of good size, the day before, so Reynolds appropriated 3 and went out the side door toward the noise. As he did, he suddenly realized that they were in the midst of a pea soup fog that was so dense one could not make out a shape more than 10 feet away. He carefully headed down the back door steps and toward the tinkling bell. When he reached the yard fence, he let fly with a potato toward what seemed to be the middle of the animal. The potato found its mark and hit with considerable plop. The slow ding-ding immediately turned into a rapid ding-ding-ding, and 2 or 3 horses or mules took off up the street. About this time, from across the narrow street in the next yard came, "Tee-bee-hee," and then, "Ha ha ha." It was the voice of Mr. Arnold, manager of the Crossett Lumber Company. He and Mrs. Arnold had been awakened by the same bell, and he was also out in his yard trying to decide what to do about the bell. After a good laugh together, they both went back to bed and let someone up the street worry about what to do about the bell. To this day, Reynolds wondered what would have happened if he had missed the mule with the potato and hit Mr. Arnold. What sidewalks there were in town were wooden, and although these were kept in pretty good repair, one always had to watch for a broken or rotten board when walking thereon. There was only one store in town, and this was, you guessed it, the company store. It was located on the corner of what is now Highway 82 and Main Street. It was a large rambling wooden building with a second-story mezzanine all around the large main floor. The store had many departments, including groceries, hardware, clothing, and furniture. If one wanted drugs or ice cream, such items could be had by descending 2 steps into an attached separate room. All sawmill and woods employees were encouraged to trade at the company, Santo, and to help bring this about, the workers could draw 1 week's pay in advance, but this was in the form of coupon books that were good only at this store. The company owned all the land in town and an area of about 2 square miles surrounding, and, except for the railroad buildings and Western Union, no other private enterprise was allowed. Those who wished to establish a business had to purchase land outside the village limits. It was because of this that North Crossett, West Crossett, and South Crossett came into being. Prices in the stores in these places often were a bit cheaper than in the company store, and those who could resist the temptation of borrowing against next week's pay could have cash to trade in the outlying communities. Because the company owned all houses and other buildings, and would only rent, it could readily determine who would occupy each house. They would rent only to those who worked at the mills or offices, plus the few exceptions like Reynolds and Geneva who worked for the Forest Service. Thus, there was no unemployment in town, and very little crime and drinking. If an employee did not produce at his job or caused any trouble, out of town he would go. Although pay in the sawmill and woods was not large, the cost of rental living quarters was very reasonable. Rates ranged from $5 to $17 per month for most houses, and one could buy a refrigerator or stove on time at the company store at a very low rate per month. One could also obtain all the wood he wanted for heating and cooking just for the cutting on company lands. This essay is based on the work of R. Reynolds, The Crossett Story, the beginning of forestry in southern Arkansas and northern Louisiana. All credit for the original research and findings goes to him. This essay is intended to summarize and present his findings in a format accessible to the general public. The information was found in what we are calling the Ovid Switzer papers, which we currently have on loan.